Religion is a headache, and there's no better example than in the Old Testament. Rule upon rule upon rule in the law. And Moses comes down from the mountain. He's got the tablets in his hand, and the people take the tablets and they read what's on them, and then they look at everything that's written in the law, and they tell God, they tell him, we're going to do everything written in the book. And you know the story? You know how it went? From then on, we see failure upon failure upon failure. And that's religion for you. And if you fast forward a few thousand years, you end up with Martin Luther coming to the same conclusion, beating himself over his sins, overcome with guilt, lying out in the snow all night long until his colleagues come and drag him to safety, overcome with his own failures, wondering, when is enough enough, and how am I going to please God, and when am I going to get in his good graces and stay there? And that's the story of religion. Anytime anyone takes religion seriously, the same result is always there. Failure. How do we change it? On this side of the cross as Christians, how do we enjoy a relationship with Jesus without religion? The cross changes everything, but why and how and what difference does it really make? That's what we're going to talk about in the Naked Gospel. And I'd like to start having you imagine this story between Moses and Jesus, and this conversation that never took place. But imagine Moses were to demand something of Jesus, saying, papers, please. And Jesus would have no papers, at least no papers that would qualify him. Because according to the law, Moses said that anyone who wanted to serve as a priest, a high priest, a representative to the people spiritually before God, that person had to be of the tribe of Levi, a Levitical priest. And yet Jesus was of the tribe of Judah, a different tribe, outside of the regulations. Why would God do that? What was his reasoning behind it? God did it on purpose. He did it on purpose to show that if we appeal to Jesus, then we appeal to an outsider. We appeal to a renegade, a table turner, someone who changes the whole system. When there's a change of priesthood, there must also be a change of covenant, the Bible says. And that's the whole point. That if we appeal to God through Jesus, we can't appeal to him through the law. And you can find all kinds of debate in the Christian world, can't you, about law and grace, and shouldn't it be a balance between law and grace, and shouldn't we compromise between the old way and the new way and find a nice mix? But the reality is there's no place for a mix, because the regulation says Jesus can't be priest. But we know he's our priest, and so therefore, because that priesthood has changed, we don't go back to an old system. Jesus and Moses just don't mix. I want you to think about this for a second. Imagine you were to go to the car dealership and buy a Honda Accord. Let's say you get out the door for $19,500, a steal. But then 430 days later, more than a year later, the dealer leaves a voicemail and you check it out and it says, you got to come back into the dealership. We got to renegotiate this thing because there was a mistake and you owe $2,000 more. Well, immediately you click out of your voicemail and you say, I'm going to call my lawyer. I'm going to call my attorney and check this out. Can they do this? And will they really try to go through with this? Well, the attorney says, don't worry. There's no way that they can add something later to a contract that's already been ratified. This is the exact example that we find in Galatians to make a very important point about law and grace, about the old way and the new way. And the whole point is that something that comes later does not affect a contract that's previously ratified. The promise of the new came 430 years before the law. Being right with God never had anything to do with Moses. I got in trouble a lot as a teenager. I accrued many violations on America's highways. And one of those incidents I'll never forget. In fact, it's quite shocking as I look back on it. The police officer pulled me over again on that same highway. But this time he had a curious smile on his face. And he pulled me over and he came up to the window and he said, Mr. Farley, I just want to thank you. And I said, thank you? He said, yeah, I want to thank you for driving today at a safe speed. In fact, here's a certificate redeemable at the Division of Motor Vehicles gift shop for $200 worth of merchandise. I nearly fainted. You don't see that kind of scene very often. In fact, you never see it. In fact, I didn't see it. But I tell you that fictitious story to make a point. The law will never compliment you. The law will never praise you. The law will never build you up. The law was designed to do one thing and one thing only, to point its bony finger at you whenever you fail. And that's what the law did for Israel in the Old Testament. And that's what the law will do for you today. Yeah, even as a Christian, the law is designed to make us conscious of sins. But when we come to Christ, we're freed from the law. We die to it so that there's a brand new way to live. We can't mix the law with Jesus. We can't mix religion with this dynamic, radical new way to live. You know, what's interesting about the law is I talk about our freedom from the law all over the country. I find people with the same arguments sort of talking over and over about, well, I don't mean that we have to obey the regulations in Leviticus. I mean, we're free from those, but the Ten Commandments, I mean, we still need the Ten Commandments. And even then, we don't know what we're saying. Because, for example, the Sabbath is part of the Ten Commandments. And you know, Friday night through Saturday night, are you ever doing any work? Do you ever find yourself on email? Do you ever find yourself mowing lawns, cleaning the house? I mean, these are infringements against the Sabbath, one of the 10. And so the point is this, is that we can't chop up God's law. We can't dice it up into our favorite parts and say we need this part but not that part. The reality is, the radical, black, white, and radical truth is that God has rescued us from the entirety of the law. The law is an all or nothing proposition. James says that if you keep the whole law and you stumble in one point, then you're guilty of all of it. And that's why Jesus had to come and free us from every ounce of the law so that we can enjoy this new way, the new way of freedom that involves forgiveness and acceptance, the kindness of God that tutors us to live a different way. I want you to think lastly about the Garden of Eden, how this all got started. What was the sales pitch? You know, the sales pitch in that garden was, you will be like God. And with that, Adam and Eve were sunk. See, it wasn't that they were going to try to do something bad looking. They were sold on the idea of trying to be godly, of trying to be godlike. And that's what killed them. So in the same way, and when we can go after the tree of knowledge of good and evil, go after the religious tree, the morality tree, the tree of ethics, and we think we're doing the right thing, and yet there was another tree in that garden. It was a tree of life, a very different way to live, not with morality and ethics in mind, not with right and wrong, with good and evil, but with the life of Jesus Christ, animating our every move, showing us how to live and why to live that way, and counseling our minds. Not an outward religion written on stone, not a bunch of rules and regulations that Colossians says have the appearance of wisdom but lack any value. Instead, a dynamic, vibrant, new thing, a relationship, something internal, something awesome when you think about the union that you and I can have with Jesus Christ. You know, they fell for it. They fell for the allure of rules. They fell for the attractiveness of religion. And yet, what's the reality there? It's an empty, empty shell, whitewashed tombs, those religious people are. And we can find ourselves stalled and stagnant and asking the same questions they did. But there is an answer. The answer won't be found in polishing ourselves, in self-improvement, in rules, in stuff to do for God, but instead in figuring out what God did for us through Jesus Christ.